36 nations. One summit, $0 accepted. The Kazan BRICS gathering just concluded, and the financial architecture holding American power together took a hit most Americans will never hear about until it's already changed the price of everything they buy. The consequence isn't abstract. It's not happening in some distant boardroom. The shift that began in Kazan affects the mortgage rate you'll pay next year, the value of your retirement account, and whether your children inherit an economy where the United States sets the rules or follows them. Every transaction that moves away from the dollar system reduces demand for U.S. Treasury bonds. Lower demand means higher interest rates. Higher rates mean your cost of borrowing goes up even if the Federal Reserve does nothing. This already started. You just haven't connected the dots yet. This channel runs on no corporate funding, no government backing, and no advertising pressure telling us what to leave out. If this kind of analysis matters to you, the kind that connects what happens in Kazan to what happens in your wallet, hit subscribe and turn on notifications. The analysis that needs to happen about what Putin just set in motion is not happening on mainstream platforms. It's happening here. Let me show you exactly what happened in Kazan and why the silence from Western media is louder than anything in their coverage. The BRICS summit concluded October 24th. 36 nations attended. Not just the core BRICS members, Brazil, Russia, India, China, South Africa, but nations representing over 45% of global population and roughly 35% of global GDP when you include every delegation that showed up. The official attendance list included Iran, Saudi Arabia, UAE, Egypt, Ethiopia, Indonesia, Turkey, and dozens more. Some came as full members. Others came as partner nations. But every single one came because they're calculating whether the dollar system still serves their interests or whether it's time to build an alternative. Here's what the official statements won't tell you. Putin didn't fly to Kazan to shake hands and take photos. He flew there to formalize the infrastructure for what's been quietly building for 3 years, a parallel payment system that bypasses SWIFT, bypasses Western banks, and settles trade in currencies other than the US dollar. The formal name is BRICS Bridge. The technical designation is a multilateral digital platform for cross-border payments using central bank digital currencies and local currency settlements. The practical translation is this: countries can now trade with each other without touching dollars at any point in the transaction chain. The Pentagon called this a symbolic political gathering. The operational reality shows something far more concrete. Turkey, a NATO member for 72 years, sent its president to Kazan. Saudi Arabia, the nation whose oil for dollars arrangement has anchored the petrodollar system since 1974, sent high-level representation to discuss yuan-denominated oil contracts. Indonesia, the world's fourth most populous nation, attended specifically to explore rupiah-yuan swap arrangements that would reduce its dollar exposure. These are not symbolic gestures. These are sovereignty calculations. Now here's the part that makes this more dangerous than any previous attempt to challenge dollar dominance. Every prior challenge came from a single nation or a weak coalition. Saddam Hussein announced oil for euros in 2000. Muammar Gaddafi proposed a gold-backed dinar for African oil trade in 2009. Venezuela tried selling oil in yuan in 2018. Every single one of those efforts either collapsed or the leader proposing them met an unfortunate end shortly after. The pattern was clear: challenge the dollar alone, and you stand alone against the full weight of American financial and military power. What Putin assembled in Kazan is categorically different. This isn't one dictator making noise. This is 36 nations, including some of America's supposed allies, building redundant infrastructure that doesn't require American permission to operate. The BRICS Bridge runs on distributed ledger technology. It connects the central banks of member states directly: Russia's central bank to China's, China's to Brazil's, Brazil's to India's, India's to Saudi Arabia's. No correspondent banking through New York. No SWIFT messaging system headquartered in Belgium but controlled by Washington. Just direct bilateral settlement in whatever currencies the trading partners agree to use. The evidence for how far this has already progressed came out during the summit itself. Putin announced that 95% of Russia-China trade now settles in rubles and yuan, not dollars, not euros. The two nations conducting over $200 billion in annual trade have almost entirely exited the dollar system for bilateral commerce. Now read that again slowly. $200 billion in trade happening completely outside dollar rails. That's not theoretical. That's operational reality right now. Here's what they're not telling you in the financial press. The BRICS Bridge pilot program has already processed transactions. Real money moved between real central banks using this infrastructure during the summit week as a demonstration. The technical infrastructure isn't some future proposal that needs years of development. It exists. It functions. The only question remaining is how fast adoption accelerates beyond the pilot phase. Stop and think about that for a second. The United States spent decades convincing the world that dollar-based transactions were not just convenient but necessary. That narrative just broke. Not in theory, in practice. And the nations demonstrating it works represent half the human population. Now let me show you the number that explains this entire strategic shift better than any diplomatic statement or summit communique. Here's the math that makes the BRICS currency initiative not just viable but increasingly inevitable. The United States national debt currently sits at $35.7 trillion. Annual interest payments on that debt just crossed $1 trillion for the first time in American history. That's $1 trillion per year just to service existing debt, not to pay it down, not to fund new programs, just to make the interest payments on money already borrowed. Here's where it gets brutal. The only reason the United States can sustain $35.7 trillion in debt without immediate economic collapse is because global demand for dollars keeps treasury yields relatively low. Nations need dollars to buy oil. They need dollars to participate in international trade. They need dollars to hold as foreign exchange reserves. That demand creates a captive market for U.S. government bonds. As long as global demand for dollars remains high, the U.S. can continue borrowing at manageable rates. But watch what happens when that demand erodes. If even 20% of current dollar-denominated trade shifts to alternative currencies over the next decade, demand for U.S. Treasury bonds falls proportionally. Lower demand means higher yields required to attract buyers. A 1% increase in the average interest rate on $35.7 trillion in debt equals $357 billion in additional annual interest costs. A 2% increase equals $714 billion. Read those numbers again. The U.S. federal budget cannot absorb an additional $700 billion in annual costs without either massive spending cuts, massive tax increases, or printing money that accelerates inflation. The BRICS nations understand this math perfectly. They understand that the dollar's reserve status is not maintained by American economic strength, but by network effects and lack of alternatives. Create a viable alternative and the network effects reverse. The first 5% of global trade that shifts away from dollars barely registers. The next 10% starts causing problems. Beyond 25%, the feedback loop becomes self-reinforcing. Higher U.S. interest rates make dollar debt more expensive, which makes alternative systems more attractive, which further reduces dollar demand, which raises rates higher still. Putin knows he doesn't need to defeat the dollar directly. He just needs to build the infrastructure that allows nations to avoid it, then wait for American fiscal mathematics to do the rest. Every $1 trillion the U.S. adds to its national debt accelerates the timeline. Every percentage point increase in Treasury yields makes the alternative systems more appealing. The BRICS bridge is not a weapon designed to destroy dollar dominance next year. It's a patient architecture designed to provide options when dollar dominance becomes unsustainable on its own terms. Here's the asymmetry that keeps Pentagon strategists awake. The United States spends roughly $900 billion per year on defense. That military spending is financed substantially through deficit spending, which requires selling treasury bonds to foreign buyers, many of whom are the same nations now building alternative payment systems. The more the U.S. spends on military power to maintain global dominance, the more it must borrow. The more it borrows, the more vulnerable it becomes to those same nations reducing their treasury holdings. China alone holds over $800 billion in U.S. Treasury securities. Russia has reduced its holdings to nearly zero over the past 6 years, moving reserves into gold and yuan-denominated assets instead. The strategic calculation is coldly logical. If you're China, holding $800 billion in U.S. debt gives you leverage, but it also makes you vulnerable to U.S. monetary policy. Inflation reduces the real value of your holdings. Dollar depreciation cuts your purchasing power. And if tensions escalate toward military conflict, those holdings could be frozen or seized under sanctions. The safer strategy is to slowly reduce dollar exposure while building alternative systems that let you trade with partners without accumulating dollar reserves at all. That's exactly what's happening. China's treasury holdings peaked at over $1.3 trillion in 2013. They've declined every year since. The reduction is gradual enough to avoid triggering a crisis, but persistent enough to signal a long-term strategic shift. Now pull back from the immediate crisis and look at what Russia is learning from its own experience over the past 3 years. The United States and European Union imposed the most comprehensive sanctions regime in modern history on Russia in February 2022, froze $300 billion in Russian central bank reserves, removed Russian banks from SWIFT, blocked access to Western financial systems. The intended effect was economic collapse within months. The Russian ruble was supposed to crater. The Russian economy was supposed to contract by double digits. Putin was supposed to face internal revolt from an economically devastated population. None of that happened. The ruble stabilized within weeks. The Russian economy contracted roughly 2% in 2022, then returned to growth in 2023. Oil continued flowing to India and China at only modest discounts. Natural gas found alternative buyers. And the Russian government discovered something critical. You can operate a modern economy outside Western financial infrastructure if you're willing to accept short-term pain for long-term autonomy. That lesson is not lost on every other nation watching these events unfold. China is watching and drawing conclusions. The scenario where China moves on Taiwan looks economically catastrophic if dollar-based trade is the only option. Sanctions would devastate Chinese access to Western markets. But if China has spent the previous decade building alternative trade corridors, alternative payment systems, and alternative reserve currencies, the economic cost of Western sanctions drops substantially. Not to zero, sanctions would still hurt, but to levels that might be strategically acceptable given the stakes involved. The BRICS infrastructure Putin is building gives China strategic options it wouldn't otherwise have. Every nation watching Russia survive comprehensive sanctions is recalculating the cost-benefit analysis of alignment with Washington versus strategic autonomy. Turkey sees Russia selling energy to Europe through intermediaries despite sanctions and asks whether NATO membership is worth the constraints it imposes. Saudi Arabia sees the yuan for oil option and asks whether the 50-year petrodollar arrangement still serves Saudi interests or just locks them into American foreign policy. India sees Russia buying rupee-denominated goods and asks why it's holding $600 billion in treasury securities when it could diversify into assets that can't be frozen by executive order. The pattern that matters is this: the United States built a global financial system where dollar dominance gave it unilateral power to impose costs on adversaries through sanctions, asset freezes, and financial exclusion. That system worked brilliantly for 3 decades because there was no alternative. But the more aggressively Washington uses those tools, the faster targeted nations build alternatives. And once those alternatives exist, even nations not currently targeted start hedging their bets because they've watched what happens when you can't. Here's the dimension almost nobody in Western analysis is discussing honestly. The dollar reserve system is not maintained by American productivity or American innovation. It's maintained by structural dependency created through historical accident. The Bretton Woods system established dollar centrality in 1944 when the U.S. held most of the world's gold and hadn't been physically devastated by World War II. The petrodollar system locked it in during the 1970s when Saudi Arabia agreed to price oil exclusively in dollars. But neither of those structural supports is permanent. The gold standard ended in 1971. The petrodollar exclusivity is ending right now. What comes next is not predetermined. The most honest financial analysis produced by any Western institution came from Credit Suisse in 2022 before it collapsed and got absorbed by UBS. Their sovereign risk team published a report titled The End of Dollar Dominance that calculated the timeline for significant erosion in reserve status. Their conclusion: if current trends continue, the dollar could fall from 60% of global reserves to 40% within 15 years. That might not sound dramatic, but the second-order effects would be catastrophic for American fiscal stability. A 20 percentage point drop in reserve demand translates to hundreds of billions in additional annual borrowing costs when you're carrying $35 trillion in debt. Now here's where Putin's strategy gets genuinely sophisticated. He's not trying to replace the dollar with the ruble. Russia's economy is too small. The ruble lacks the credibility to serve as a global reserve currency. Putin knows this. What he's building instead is a system where multiple currencies coexist in regional trading blocks, with periodic settlement through commodities, gold, or digital clearing mechanisms. The BRICS bridge doesn't require a new reserve currency. It just requires mechanisms for converting bilateral trade flows into settlement assets both sides will accept. Gold serves this function. Russia and China have both been accumulating gold reserves for over a decade. Russia's central bank now holds over 2,300 tons. China likely holds over 4,000 tons. though exact figures are opaque. Neither nation is returning to a gold standard, but both are ensuring they hold settlement assets that can't be printed by the Federal Reserve or frozen by the U.S. Treasury. In a multipolar currency world, the nation with hard assets wins disputes about settlement. The nation relying entirely on fiat currency issued by foreign central banks becomes structurally vulnerable. The timeline for when this shift becomes visible to average Americans is closer than most realize. Here are my 3 predictions with clocks attached. First, within 18 months, Saudi Arabia announces its first major oil contract, denominated entirely in yuan, with settlement through the Shanghai Petroleum Exchange. The announcement will be framed as diversification, not abandonment of the dollar, but the precedent breaks the psychological barrier that's held for 50 years. Second, within 3 years, the BRICS bridge processes over $500 billion in annual transactions, making it a systemically important payment infrastructure that can't be ignored or easily sanctioned. Third, within 5 years, U.S. Treasury yields spike above 6% as foreign central banks reduce dollar reserve holdings, forcing the Federal Reserve to choose between defending the currency through rate hikes that crash the domestic economy or accommodating inflation through continued bond purchases that destroy the dollar's purchasing power. The scenario playing out in slow motion is one where America doesn't lose a currency war in a single dramatic moment. Instead, dollar dominance erodes gradually through 1,000 small decisions by foreign central banks, multinational corporations, and commodity traders who realize they have options they didn't have before. Each individual decision seems rational and modest. Collectively, they reshape the global financial order in ways that take decades to reverse. What burned in Kazan last week is not just another summit. It's the formalization of infrastructure that makes dollar alternatives operational rather than theoretical. The belief that American financial dominance is permanent just took damage that won't fully show up in economic data for years, but will be impossible to reverse once the trends become visible. Drop your prediction in the comments. Which happens first, the Saudi yuan oil contract, the BRICS bridge crossing $500 billion annually, or Treasury yields spiking above 6%? Tell me, because I read every single one, and the range of perspectives matters. When we're all trying to see around corners, the mainstream press won't even acknowledge exist. If this gave you a framework for understanding currency shifts that you're not getting from financial media designed to sell optimism, share this with one person who needs to understand what's actually happening to the system that's held American power together for 80 years. The next video goes somewhere even this one didn't reach. We're going to trace exactly where dollar outflows are landing and which nations are positioning themselves to benefit most when the reserve currency rebalancing accelerates. Subscribe so you're there when it lands.